Autopsy results are confirming the remains found in Wyoming over the weekend belong to Gabby Petito. As we've been reporting, the 22-year-old went missing while on vacation with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. He returned from the trip without Petito and has since disappeared. In the days since the case hit the mainstream, social media has become a hotbed of discourse, and users have been posting their theories across TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. New York Times features reporter Katie Rosman joins us to discuss how the internet is reacting. Katie, I'm so happy to have you on the show to talk about this because I was just speaking to our national correspondent, Jerika Duncan, who's been covering the story about this very issue, that there have been thousands of posts about Gabby Petito since her case first entered the national consciousness. And I wonder if that is what has sort of fueled the interest in her case, because, you know, and we'll talk about this too, there's certainly a lot of people that are pointing to the fact that she's a pretty blonde white woman, and that is why she's getting so much attention. That may be true at a certain extent, but I also wonder about her really deep presence on social media and people who are sort of internet sleuths, how that's played into why this is so interesting to so many people.
Well, thank you for having me. And I agree. I think it's a pretty dynamic hodgepodge of things that have led us to this moment of maximum attention on this case. I think that it started to get attention during a relatively slow news cycle as well, right after the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We had a break from the hurricanes. And I think in the way that things go viral, whether on the internet or within the mainstream media, it's often hard to really pinpoint exactly what has happened. I do think that there undoubtedly she was an attractive.
The case hit the mainstream. Social media has become a hotbed of discourse, and users have been posting their theories across TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. New York Times features reporter Katie Rosman joins us to discuss how the internet is reacting. Katie, I'm so happy to have you on the show to talk about this because I was just speaking to our national correspondent, Jerika Duncan, who's been covering the story about this very issue, that there have been thousands of posts about Gabby Petito since her case first entered the national consciousness. And I wonder if that is what has sort of fueled the interest in her case, because, you know, and we'll talk about this too, there's certainly a lot of people that are pointing to the fact that she's a pretty blonde white woman, and that is why she's getting so much attention. That may be true at a certain extent, but I also wonder about her really deep presence on social media and people who are sort of internet sleuths, how that's played into why this is so interesting to so many people.
And was this caption written by him or her, because it's different than the one she's written in the past? And it had allowed this engagement and almost interactivity among armchair sleuths and people who have been sitting at home with their computers and phones for the last 18 months. And I think that was an incredible accelerant to get to the moment that we're at now.
It's such an important point, Katie, because I was thinking the same thing. And, you know, the very first story I ever did as a reporter was when I was still a student at Columbia. And I did a story on all the missing black and brown women that go unreported for years. And so this is really sort of something that I'm really passionate about. But to your point about the fact that folks have been at home for the last 18 months. We are using our computers more than we ever did because we're just at home when we're not working. And the fact that, you know, there were these digital breadcrumbs that people were able to pick up on, or digital threads that people were able to pull in real time as we waited for the news as to whether or not she would be found. And then when she was found, whether or not it would be Gabby. And now that we know that it's her, Brian Laundrie, where is he? And now you've got people jumping into that. So it does feel like this is a story, and I don't want to be callous about it, but it's sort of made for the age of COVID.
In a lot, I agree. And I also agree. I worry very much about, you know, talking about this as data points when this is somebody's daughter and sister and a human being whose life has been cut short in probably a really terrible way. all of that being said, I do come in to look at sort of what this says about media and what this says about society. And I think that the sort of how online we all have been and how at home we all have been really has an impact. I also think during that same time and in the couple of years preceding COVID, true crime through the audio medium especially has become huge. And so you have all these aficionados of true crime who spend hours listening to cold cases, cases that have never been solved. And they're going back to things from my younger days as a journalist, John Bonet and Lacey Peterson and the Menendez brothers, which is slightly different, and now here is something contemporary and contemporaneous to the moment, somebody that a lot of young people can identify with, in many cases, her race, but her age too. I think that there's also something to be said about being in a relationship that really looks normal on the outside and that you're putting a lot of energy into keeping things pulled together and keeping up appearances on social media. And if you watch, as I have, the very anguishing body cam video from when they interacted with the police, you see a very distraught young woman, to my eye, really trying to keep herself pulled together and keep the appearance of this relationship pulled together. And I think that that's something, unfortunately, that a lot of young people and young women can identify with also.
Katie, it's an excellent point. I watched that video of that interaction with the police, and of course, the police have a difficult job to do. I'm not pointing fingers at them or blaming them for anything, but it sort of showed, and I think a lot of young women are seeing that video, and they are posting on social media front and center what many women in this country and around the world deal with on a regular basis. In other words, you don't want to get the man in trouble. You know that if you really explain what's going on, that could mean that he's arrested, and you don't want to do that. But when you look at the statistics, that the number of women that are killed by someone in their home, someone that they're married to or someone that they're dating, and you gasp when you see those statistics, those numbers. And here you have video showing what I think a lot of people are saying, that's it right there. Now you understand.
Yeah, and presumably that issue has no race.
Right.
You know, that it's being brought to light through the story of a white woman. It is not a white problem at all. And I agree with you. And I would add, you know, she's then got to go back and get in the car with him, or, you know, spend one night apart as they did. But I think women also have the burden of, if I really tell what's going on, then what? You know, am I putting myself in worse jeopardy and in worse danger? And it looks like, it really looks like it was obviously a terrible situation. The issue of race cannot be ignored and shouldn't be ignored. And I think that we all, and I put myself in this category, need to take a hard look at the things that we pay attention to as reporters and as people with a phone in our hand. But I feel that this is bigger. I think there is more at play than race that got people really, really enthralled in this. And I really believe the internet played a huge role in it, and the idea that it was still happening as the interest took off. I mean, the interest was huge before she was even found. And I think, you know, checking your phone and is there an update? And, you know, I talked to people who said, if you zoom in on this picture, you'll see that the roots, her hair color, were more blonde in this picture than in that picture, which makes me think that he posted it, you know, sort of out of order. I mean, the amount of sleuthing that has been going on because of what Gabby and this guy put out on the internet, you know, plays a really big role. And it played a really big role, I believe, in her body being found also.
And before we let you go, Katie, we were talking about this. This has been part of our discussion about how missing white women generally are covered in the news media. And you mentioned some of those other cases, JonBenet, Natalie Holloway. The list is long. But I wonder if this could also be a moment where newsrooms across the country start to reassess how they cover this, because you've had, Natalie Holloway was back in, I think, 2005, and JonBenet was before that. This was before social media, and now because people are so vocal and they're able to sort of, I don't want to say dictate how newsrooms cover things, but they are able to bring attention and awareness to issues that perhaps might have gone unnoticed in the past. Do you think that this may lead to a reckoning on how we cover missing people generally? Because there are a lot of Native American women who are saying, what about us? A lot of African American and Latina women, and even the LGBTQ community has had issues with this type of coverage. I wonder if, and we should also distinguish that a lot of these stories are covered in local newspapers. I think what a lot of people are sometimes angry about, it doesn't reach broadcast journalism or broadcast news at the national level, too.
I do think that it's going to cause everybody to read. I think we are taught, the fact that you and I are talking about this, the fact that a big part of my story was about this. In some ways, I think you could make the argument, well, maybe that's the way in. We can talk about this in a more appropriate, dignified way by talking about the fact that it's unfair that we're talking about it and not talking about women of color, trans women who face terrible violence that doesn't get a lot of coverage. So I do think that it's made this more of a conversation point in an important way. The issues of how many people go missing that don't get coverage at all it's a terrible one. I don't know what the answer is. Do we not cover any of it? Because really, Gabby Petito is not, what has happened to her has become newsworthy, but she wasn't a newsworthy person before. So do we cover nothing? Do we cover, do we keep track by, some chart by, well, we can't do this one because we've done too many that fit into this demographic? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. And maybe we also need to be doing more to cover the causes that lead young women to go missing. Abuse at home with their parents, abuse at home with their partner, mental illness, drug addiction. I mean, really, you can peel the layers back, and it goes it goes down to some of the deep and fundamental fissures in our society for young women and the way that they're being failed. And maybe that's something that I'll think about as a reporter and think about more as I pitch stories about trying to focus in on some of the underlying causes that lead to a moment that sadly this woman and her family have found themselves in with, they're not feeling any comfort. Oh, lucky for us, we're getting all this coverage. I mean, I can't imagine that they're feeling that they're experiencing a lot of privilege right now at all.
No, for sure. And, I'll tell you, Katie, one of the things, years ago when I was a student, I did a story on Trisha Miley, the Central Park jogger, and I went back and researched how many other women had been violently raped or assaulted in New York City the same week that Trisha Miley back in 1989 was assaulted. And I found several. They were all women of color. But here's the thing. I mean, where did I find the coverage of their stories? In the New York Times. So a lot of it also, we have to look at the spotlight of people themselves who consume news. The news was there on those women. I remember 2 women were thrown off the roofs of buildings in New York City. They actually survived. But it had been covered. It's just that, you read about it and it's women of color, they're poor women, and so you move on to the next story. Trisha Miley was a Wall Street executive. She was jogging in Central Park. That seemed to have something, that the public was more vastly interested in. So it's really fascinating discussion. I'm so happy you were able to come on and talk to us about this in your reporting, because it's really, really, really important to discuss. Sorry, you were going to say.
Thank you. Well, it sounds like you've done a lot of important work, and you should recirculate some of the things it sounds like that you've been working on. But, it's a really sad thing that people who live in the margins, we keep them in the margins. You're talking about poor Black women who were marginalized by society. And so when they were abused, it was abuse that stayed in the margins. And somebody who is living what the white establishment decides is a more mainstream existence, a white Wall Street executive. She's not in the margins, so what happens to her wouldn't be relegated to the margins. And these are really big problems that I think we all need to think about. I don't know how to solve them, but I do think thinking about them is a step in the right direction. And so I applaud the work that you did even as a student. And I'm going to spend a lot of time thinking about my work moving forward and how I can look more into the margins as a reporter.
New York Times reporter Katie Rosman, thank you very much for an illuminating discussion. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, in our 1 p.m. hour, the executive director of the National Association for Search and Rescue will discuss the Gabby Petito case. You can stream that conversation right here on CBSN.